Good evening. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to this special public presentation by internationally renowned author and professor Barry Strauss, sponsored by the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership and hosted by UWM at Waukesha as part of its Distinguished Lecture series organized by the Lectures in Fine Arts Committee that I want to say brings together truly in common cause students, faculty, and staff with the goal of enhancing the intellectual and cultural life of the campus and of this community and region. My name is Simon Bunny, and I'm the Dean of the College of General Studies of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee that includes this dynamic campus in Waukesha. This presentation is in line with the college's outreach mission of civic engagement with our communities and issues of public concern and providing ample opportunities both inside and outside the classroom for learning and participatory experiences toward building a civil society. I've been privileged to work with the Tommy J. Thompson Center on Public Leadership for several years. We were delighted to take on with Associate Director Ruth Bremish to bring this event to you. The running with the Thompson Center, we spend a little time tapping its meaningful souls to the citizens of Wisconsin. The Thompson Center was established to continue the great legacy of Governor Tommy G. Thompson, the longest University of Wisconsin, who proudly led colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to ensure and inspire and future public service for us through leadership skills and social awareness and effective public policy. So to further these goals by offering public events like these. Finally, research and scholarships on exemplary public leaders with the Distinguished Public Leadership Award and conducting other activities all across when we say Wisconsin campuses. Its events are free and open to the public. And if you haven't received a copy of their brochure, that is available on the table as you walked in, along with a program of tonight's event. I want to be sure to recognize those who brought this great event to fruition. Sue Kaliga is Assistant Director of Student Affairs. Sue? Kristen Feckenham is Assistant Dean for Finance and Administration. Don't be shy. Dr. Ron Bellotta is our campus administrator, as well as an esteemed professor of sociology on our campus at Waukesha. Ron? And some people can't believe this, but I'm not recognizing including O'Connor, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs, Greg Elmworster, our Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and Tricia Kortzel, our Executive Assistant to the Board. I'll tell them you applauded. Also chairing the Lectures in Fine Arts Committee and afterwards moderating the Q&A with Dr. Strauss is Professor Timothy Dunn. If there are other members of the Lectures in Fine Arts Committee here, including the students, if you would just stand up and be thanked. I've only received shocking news this week about the loss for this community of the Keeples, who are dedicated to being as vibrant as ever for the next year with our instruction, STEM support, and continuing education. which includes postgraduate work, educational trips, enrichment and participation programs, such as our community choir and summer youth programs. You can also learn about the Team Society, and please check out the upcoming events in this region, including and collaborative efforts, presidential election year with Donna Brazil in the theater on Tuesday, April 9th, also at 7 p.m., which is free and open to the public. Some of you may know some of her, but she's also, especially in this election year, on CNN and other outlets speaking about the election. On April 2nd, for those of you who want a non-time event, and I'll invite Professor Amy Basti, who will be speaking in C101 near the Commons on the water connection and disconnect the age and the cooling process. Let me share a couple quick housekeeping notes. Please take a moment to silence or turn off your cell phones. And again, repeating yourself after Professor Strauss's remarks, we will recognize questions from the audience by bringing in a microphone, and we have our wonderful staff over there. Yeah. So just draw their attention that you have a question, and Dr. Dunn will recognize you. Now, I turn to distinguished speaker Barry Strauss. President Rice and you about professor in linguistic studies at Cornell University, found chair of the Department of History, as well as professor in history and classics. Was also the place speaking at the institution of a series of big sons students in ancient history. He will also serve as a distinguished visiting professor in the Department of Defense Analysis at the Postgraduate School. He holds a PhD from the University in Berlin. Professor Strauss has spent years researching the STEM of the ancient brain and has written shown us mistakes and successes. He's also a writer of military legacy, whose analysis of the strategies and tactics of some of the Illustration's great commanders, such as this one on the Trojan War, revealed the successful use of engagement that were true battlefield were resident and executive suites. In recognition of the scholarship, he was sent Ocean Kulen journalists going with China sensing the Salams police. Professor Strauss is also a well-known television personality that appears on the Extra Channel, Netflix, CNN, and Discovery Channel. Is the host of the popular podcast Antiquitous, Legends of the Ancient World, which is accessible on most platforms. Professor Strauss is the author of 10 books on ancient history, which have been translated into 12 languages. There's also a display of his books in the library, which is not open now, but tomorrow, if you want to take a look, they're living here. Some best-selling recent books, The Death of Caesar, Chesapeake, Alexander, and Selection, Spartacus War, and the Trojan, which conveys valuable lessons from the past for the present and future. And I heard the mentality is really gift for the crafting of new history. Things foolish or St. Parades, thousand to please give a round Waukesha welcome to Dr. Barry Strauss. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Bronner, for that very warm and generous introduction. I'd like to thank everybody here in Waukesha who has made this possible, especially Sue Kalinka. And I would like to thank Ruth Brash and the Thompson Center for inviting me. I'd also like to recognize my old friends, Nancy and Steve Einhorn, Milwaukeeans, who are here tonight. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for turning out, especially after such a rainy day. I didn't expect it, but I come from one of the rainiest parts of the U.S., so I can handle it. Anyhow, beware the Ides of March. That's the famous statement that the soothsayer said to Caesar in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar. The Ides of March is the 15th of March. It was a day in the Roman calendar. Every month had its Ides, and the Ides of March was a bit of a spring festival in ancient Rome. But that's tomorrow, the 15th of March. Today is the 14th of March. As many of you know, it's Pi Day, for those of us who are mathematicians. But did you also know that today is National Potato Chip Day? Something worth remembering when we think about Julius Caesar, I am sure. And my subject tonight is leadership and forgiveness and the Ides of March. I'm going to talk about this general question of forgiveness and leadership, what leaders should and shouldn't forgive. And I'm going to use a historical case study of the assassination of Julius Caesar. I wrote a book about this a few years ago called The Death of Caesar, the story of history's most famous assassination. I do think it is history's most famous assassination. There certainly have been others, but it's one that resonates, and it always resonates for me ever since I read Shakespeare's play a long, long time ago. So I want to talk about what happened in the Ides of March, why Caesar was assassinated, what he did wrong. What does this have to do with forgiveness, and where does this leave us today? So 34 BC, the 15th of March, Julius Caesar had, in the previous 5 years, fought and won a civil war. It was pretty much Julius Caesar against the entire Roman establishment, and he beat them. He defeated them again and again and again, much to the distress of the Roman Senate, leaving Caesar as the most powerful man in Rome. He was a dictator, and he got a title that had never existed in Rome before. He became dictator for life, dictator in perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. This was a shocking thing to many people in Rome, not only to the elite, to the Roman people as well. They didn't want a dictator in perpetuity. They wanted to live in a republic. And yet the Roman Republic had seen very hard times in recent years. One of the reasons that there was a civil war was over the question of who would govern in the republic and whether the republic would serve the interests of a very tiny elite of a few families that dominated Roman politics, or whether it would serve the interests of the Roman people. And who were the Roman people? Were the Roman people only the citizens of Rome and Italy? Or were they everybody in this empire that then, thanks to Caesar, stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in France and Spain all the way to what is today Turkey and Syria and Israel and Palestine and Jordan, almost including Egypt as well. So these were some of the issues. Caesar thought he had settled them in a civil war by winning the civil war and by reconciling himself with his enemies. His enemies had fought hard against him in battles in Greece, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Tunisia, and in Spain. And Caesar had won them all. But Caesar felt what would make him different, what would make him different than the previous people who tried to dominate Roman politics, what would make him different was that he would pardon his enemies. he would offer them not only strict justice, but clemency, clementia in Latin, pardon. But being pardoned by Caesar was a two-edged sword. First of all, let me say that Caesar and his leading opponents were all members of the Roman nobility. These were aristocratic families who prided themselves on their lineage and frankly thought they were the most superior people in society. They were the aristocracy. They were extremely proud and extremely touchy and very eager that nobody should be superior to any of them, but they would all be equals. They would be peers in the governance of Rome. Along comes Caesar. He's brought to power on a wave of popular support. He is, to use a phrase that's not a term that's not exactly right, a populist. He's not a man of popular tastes, anything but. He's very much a Roman aristocrat and frankly a snob, but he represents the interests of the common people in Rome. And he uses the power of the people to help his own political career. Caesar was a genius. As well as being a great politician, he was a fantastic general, and he was an excellent writer. We still have two of his books today, The Gallic War and The Civil War. So Caesar felt that he had a right to be the leading figure in Roman politics. His opponents disagreed, and they'd forced him to fight a civil war. As I said, he won the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, he turned to his previous enemies and said, I forgive you. Now, how did you get forgiven in a society like this? Did Caesar issue a blanket decree? Was there a document? Was there a proclamation? No. Roman society was very much a personal society. It was a face-to-face society. It was a society in which personal relationships counted for everything, in which a handshake, a gesture, a meeting is what made society work. So what did you have to do if you wanted to get forgiven by Julius Caesar? Well, in my generation, but probably not yours, a text that everybody would refer to, what everyone would understand, is the movie The Godfather. How many of you have seen The Godfather? Okay, not too bad. If you remember, in the first scene of The Godfather, there is an undertaker, and he wants the Don Corleone, to get vengeance on two young men who beat up his daughter. And in order to do it, he says to the Don, I'll give you anything you want. How much money do you want to get this vengeance? And Don Corleone, if you remember what he says, and the undertaker's name is Bonacera, he says, Bonacera, 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 what have I done to insult you that you should treat me in this way? What he wanted Bonacera to do was to say, I accept you as my godfather. And if you remember the gesture, he wanted him to kiss his ring. He wanted him to make this personal gesture of obedience and recognition that Don Corleone was his superior. Now that's if we change things around, or we go back 2,000 years or so, that's what Caesar wanted. If you wanted to get pardoned by Julius Caesar, you had to get down on your knees. And so, Caesar, please pardon me. And Caesar said, yes, I graciously consent to pardon you. Well, as I said, these guys are Roman aristocrats. They don't accept the fact that anyone is their equal. And the fact that they had to beg Caesar for pardon really rubbed them the wrong way. As one of the historians who wrote about this in ancient times said, they were angry because they were forgiven. It weighed very heavily on them that they had to be pardoned. And the paradigmatic case, the exception that proves the rule, that tells us just how difficult this was for them to accept, is the case of Cato the Younger. Now, Cato was a famous and infamous man in Rome. Of all the aristocrats, he was the most aristocratic. And of all the enemies of the common man, he was the most dogged. He thought that the common people of Rome ought to have no say at all in their government. And it should only be the few men of breeding and education and virtue who should run society. In addition to being very, very wealthy and elite, he was also a philosopher and a bit of a nonconformist. He would walk through the streets of Rome barefoot to show how little respect he had for convention and how he thought the people of Rome should be tough and shouldn't have to wear any such softening thing as shoes or sandals. He was Caesar's arch enemy. He fought to the last breath against Caesar. And after Hussar lost one of their battles in North Africa, they lost a battle near the city of Tunis. Cato and his troops sought refuge in a walled city called Utica, like Utica, New York. Ancient Utica in North Africa, in Tunisia. And Caesar and his victorious army surrounded them. And Caesar sent a message to Cato. Cato, I'd like to forgive you. All you have to do is ask for my pardon. I'll forgive you. We'll shake, and it'll be all over. And Cato said, I'd rather be dead. I will not demean myself by asking for your forgiveness. And to show that Cato meant it, he killed himself. He committed suicide. He took his sword and fell on it and ripped himself open, and he died. It was a long, slow, agonizing death because it didn't quite work the first time. Now, Caesar was horrified and angry, and he said, Cato, I begrudge you your death because you begrudged me my pardon. Caesar knew that Cato's gesture would live on, and it would be a rallying cry for Caesar's opponents. And indeed it was. So Caesar wins the Civil War. He comes back to Rome. He celebrates a triumph. And in Roman triumphs were like Barrel's Bear Parade or something. There would be floats. And in the triumph, you would show floats of your enemies, and you would show them being defeated. And Caesar committed a very grave faux pas. One of his floats showed Cato committing suicide. And this to the Romans was a tremendous insult. And so there followed as a pamphlet war. Cato's friends hired the greatest orator of the day, Marcus Tullius Cicero, to write a pamphlet on called Cato, and about Cato's virtues. And Cicero concluded, we don't have this pamphlet anymore. We only have one line. Cicero said that Cato was the exemplar of all the manly virtues. And Caesar was outraged by this, and he wrote his own response called Anti-Cato, in which he said Cato was a lecher, he was a drunk, he was a swindler, he was no good. But there's one other person we have to bring into the story, Cato's son-in-law. Cato's son-in-law was a guy you've probably heard of, Marcus Junius Brutus. He was Cato's son-in-law, and he fought against Caesar in the Civil War. But he'd asked for a pardon, and Caesar gladly gave it to him. Caesar was very glad to give Brutus the pardon because Brutus's mother had been Caesar's mistress. And there was always rumors that Caesar was Brutus's natural father. Unlikely, because Caesar was 15 when Brutus was born. But then again, in Rome, they started young. So we can't really be sure. So Caesar pardons Brutus, but Brutus is married to Cato's daughter. And Cato's daughter is a woman of iron character. Her name is Portia. And she's constantly whispering to Brutus's ear, how can we let a man like Caesar dominate Rome? How can we, as free people, free citizens of the Roman Republic, allow somebody to be a dictator and a dictator for life? And how can we tolerate the fact that somebody who has pardoned everyone, how can we tolerate the fact that we were humiliated? You and your fellow aristocrats were humiliated by getting down on your knees and asking this guy for pardon. They didn't all have to get on their knees, but some of them did. And they all felt as if they had gotten down on their knees to have to ask Caesar's consent. So Caesar, as a result of this, Julius joins a conspiracy, a plot to assassinate Julius Caesar. A group of Roman senators, Brutus, Cassius, Gaius Cassius, and another man, lecturer, very famous for Shakespeare's play, another one who's not so famous, Decimus Brutus Albinus, a distant cousin of Marcus Brutus. They're the leaders of a conspiracy that ultimately involves 60 senators, 60 Roman senators decide to assassinate Julius Caesar. And they decide, because as I told you, this is a personal society, they decide it's personal. It's not just business, it's personal. So they're not going to hire an assassin to do it. They're not going to have Caesar killed by some thug on the Appian Way. Rather, they're going to kill Caesar themselves. And they're going to kill him at a meeting of the Roman Senate to make it clear that this is not just a private vendetta. This is about the Roman state. It's about the freedom of all Roman citizens. That's why they want to do this in a public occasion, at a meeting of the Senate. They choose the last day they possibly can to make this happen. The year is 35 BC. Caesar's been fighting all over the Mediterranean, the Civil War that's gone on for years. He came back to Rome finally in October of 35. He didn't like it. He didn't like being back in Rome. He didn't like being drawn into the petty quarrels and squabbles of the Roman elite. And so he announced he was going to leave again, this time to start a new war, fight against Parthia, the Iranian Empire of this period, the 1st century BCE. So Caesar is preparing to leave, and he's going to leave Rome on the 18th of March. But there's a Senate meeting called for the 15th of March. And the conspirators realize this is our last chance. This is our last chance to get Caesar. And so they lay their plot very well. They lure Caesar to the Senate meeting. They surround him. They petition him. They come out of the podium in the front of the room, come around him. They petition him. And under their togas, they've got daggers. No metal detectors in ancient Rome. They pull out the daggers and they start stabbing Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar was shocked. He didn't expect this. He knew there had been rumors. He had rumors all the time of conspiracies against him. But he said, who would be crazy enough to kill me? We just had a civil war. Tens of thousands of Romans died in battles. If they kill me, what's going to happen again? I'm untouchable. In fact, Caesar had a bodyguard. As a Roman general, he was entitled to a bodyguard. And when he got back to Rome, he dismissed his bodyguard. He was so certain that he was untouchable that he didn't even think he needed a bodyguard. He didn't want to present the image that other people wanted to kill him. He wanted to present the image, I forgive him, it's over, we're clear. But he couldn't have been more wrong. So he's shocked. He says, this is violence. They say, yeah, sure is. And they stab him 23 times. He dies at the foot of the statue of his enemy, Pompey the Great, one of the men who was killed in the Civil War against Caesar. And the assassins leave the Senate house, brandishing their daggers, marching through the streets of Rome, proclaiming liberty. They've killed the dictator. It doesn't work out. As you probably know, there's pushback. There is indeed a new civil war. There are a series of civil wars. And it takes about 15 years before the smoke finally clears and Rome is at peace. And by the time Rome is at peace, it's going to have not only a dictator, it's going to have an emperor. Now, how could things have gone so wrong? What did Caesar get wrong? Now, I imagine Julius Caesar, if he lived a little bit longer, he didn't have to live a little longer. Caesar was in touch with some of the great religions of the Mediterranean of his day. Rome had a Jewish community. Caesar was in touch with the Jewish community. Caesar might have known that Judaism teaches that revenge is bad and holding a grudge is bad. Forgiveness is good. And Caesar might have said, hey, I did the right thing. I forgave my enemies. What did I do wrong? And if Caesar had lived just a little bit longer, another generation or two, he could have met Jesus. And he could have gone to the Sermon on the Mount. He could have heard Jesus say, if somebody strikes your cheek, turn the other cheek. Do not seek revenge. Do not hold a grudge. Love your enemies. We could have heard St. Paul, the letter to the Romans, in which he says, do not seek vengeance. Vengeance is the Lord's. Let God figure it out. It's not up to human beings to seek vengeance. We should forgive each other. And Caesar might have said, I did the right thing. I forgave my enemies. What wrong for me? Why did it all blow up in my face? So that's the answer. Well, I guess I would also say that we all think in our lives that forgiveness is a good thing. We think revenge is a bad thing. Even Don Corleone, the Godfather, forgoes the vengeance for his son, Sonny, who was killed by one of his mafia enemies, in order to have peace. So here's poor Caesar saying, I did the right thing. Why did it not work? And I think there are two answers. First of all, Caesar was thinking in personal terms. As I said, Roman politics was very personalized. And Caesar was thinking, I know these guys. If I forgive them one by one, we'll shake on it. I will reward them with jobs, which he did. He rewarded them with jobs, and I'll be fine. The second mistake that he made was he was arrogant. He thought he was untouchable. He could have forgiven these people, but had a bodyguard wherever he went. He could have worn armor to the Senate meeting, as indeed some of the Roman emperors later on did. They wore armor to Senate meetings because they knew what could happen. He could have accepted the fact that he wasn't just an ordinary person anymore. He put himself above the law, and he had to think in terms not of what's good for me as a person, but what's good for the state as a whole, what's good for society as a whole. So there's a lesson here. I think it goes something like this, that on an individual level and in our personal relationships, forgiveness is a great thing. But leaders have to think differently. They don't have the luxury of forgiving others, or just they don't have the luxury of thinking, I should, as a matter of course, forgive my enemies. They have to think, they have to ask, what's good for society as a whole? What's good for my country as a whole? For Rome, under Caesar, after the Civil War, it wasn't good for Caesar to have forgiven his enemies. That should he have done. Really? We can look at what comes after Caesar. After Caesar dies, his will is read, and it turns out that he has adopted his grandnephew, his sister's daughter's son, as his heir, because he doesn't have any legitimate children of his own. And he does have a son by Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. But that son is going to one day be the Pharaoh. He's going to be the king of Egypt. But no Roman could possibly accept him as Caesar's Roman heir. So Caesar adopts his grandnephew, a 18-year-old kid named Octavian, just turns out to be a political genius, and goes on to defeat all his enemies and become Rome's first emperor. the Emperor Augustus. That's the title he takes. What is Octavian's attitude towards the men who had assassinated his great uncle and his adoptive father, Julius Caesar? Does he forgive them? No. He says that he will not rest until he has killed every last one of them. And that turns out to be correct. He kills every last one. Not personally, he has them killed, but nobody who was part of the assassination plot against Caesar survives. And even some who were suspected of being in the plot but who weren't in it were also killed. And then the cherry on top of the cake, Augustus builds a new temple in the heart of Rome. It's a temple to vengeance. It's called Mars Ator, the temple to Mars, the rare god, the avenger. His attitude is not that forgiveness is good, but that vengeance is good. Now, it's not that he was incapable of forgiveness. In fact, there are a number of people who he fights in his civil war who he does forgive, because he calculates that in these cases, it is acceptable to forgive them. By the way, he had a bodyguard. He did not go to the Senate without wearing armor. He was very careful about what he did. But he calculated that political forgiveness is really a political question. It's not a personal question. And you need to look at the good of the organization as a whole. I think this is true for all leaders and all leadership. You have to think of yourself not as the person, but as the office. It doesn't mean that you have to be inhuman, but you have to realize that when you have an office, you have certain responsibilities, and they're not about you. You don't take things personally, and you don't decide whether to forgive or not personally. Let's look at a few other examples. If we fast forward to modern time, maybe one of the greatest examples of political forgiveness is the example of Nelson Mandela, who, after decades in prison, and when he became president of South Africa, essentially forgave the people who had mistreated him and repressed so many millions of people for so many years in South Africa. He set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whose job was not to punish, although some people were punished, so much as to restore society, to reconcile. That was a case where the political decision, the right political decision, was reconciliation and forgiveness. But is that always the case? I think not. Let's take another example from American history. The Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln famously said in his second inaugural address, as he saw the war coming to a very rapid conclusion, it ended about a month later, he famously said that his attitude towards the South, towards the Confederacy, should be one of reconciliation. As he said, with malice towards none, with charity towards all. It sounds like a noble goal, and on one level, it was a noble goal. There's only one problem. If you were going to show charity, if your main goal is to show charity to the former Confederates, what about the victims of the Confederacy? What about the ex-slaves? What would be your attitude towards them? In fact, Lincoln's attitude towards the ex-slaves was ambiguous, and he needed to be pushed. He actually considered the possibility of making the slaves go back to Africa. Fortunately, he quickly got rid of that idea and got behind, I think it's the 15th Amendment that abolished slavery in the United States. That being said, the abolition of slavery was not met with the kinds of things that it might have been met with. It was not met with recompense for the slaves. It was not met with reparations. It was not met with adequate programs to bring slaves into the society of free people. Certainly there were some programs. There was the Freedmen's Bureau, but it was very limited. And the desire to reconcile with the South, to forgive the South and bring things back to normal, stood in the way of the political goal that would have been better for the country as a whole, which would have required, frankly, a certain amount of not forgiving and a certain amount of not reconciliation. That would have served a larger political goal. Now, of course, we can't blame Lincoln too much because Lincoln was assassinated, and we don't know what he would have done had he lived. But I think it's fair to say that the North as a whole privileged reconciling with the South over bringing the slaves, the ex-slaves, into the society of free men and women. So my point is that what we learn from the case of Caesar and what we learn from these modern cases is that leaders have to make tough choices and they have to make hard decisions. That leaders can't afford to have illusions. Caesar thought he could have it both ways. He thought he could be dictator for life, but he also thought he could be just one of the boys, just a Roman aristocrat, shake hands with people, and everything will go back to the way it had been before there had been a civil war. But that was not the case. He needed to understand that in order to be forgiving to his own society, he couldn't be forgiving to the people who had fought against him. As I said, it took another civil war to finally solve this problem and finally get the lesson clear. And so what should have ended in 35 BC, in theory, the Civil War started in 39 and it ended in 45. And Caesar was going to ride off into the sunset and conquer some new lands for Rome. That should have been the end of the Civil War. Instead, Caesar was assassinated. The war begins again, and it doesn't end until the year 30. So 13 more years of war and many tens of thousands of casualties before one finally gets the point and finally gets it right in leadership and reconciliation. So that's my story. If I was going to show you my slides, I would show you a very beautiful slide of where Caesar was cremated in Rome. Quite a fascinating place. It's on the edge of the Roman Forum. That's where Caesar was cremated, and that's where ultimately Augustus builds a temple to the deified Julius Caesar, who becomes a god in the Roman pantheon. What's really remarkable about it is that even today, people come and leave flowers in the site of where Caesar was cremated. People remember Caesar as a friend of the Roman people. People remember Caesar as a tragic figure who tried to reform society, but didn't really understand the harsh lessons of leadership were even harsher than he thought. Well, I hope I can leave you with that thought today and that you all go on to become great leaders. Thank you. Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Strauss, for that excellent, very engaging talk. You're very welcome. So as Dean Bonner mentioned at the beginning, we have a couple of people with microphones who will be running up and down the stairs, giving them a good workout. And so if you have a question, if you could just raise your hand and one of the microphone bearers will come around to you and you can ask your question.
Thank you for sharing that history, which isn't widely known. But is it a corollary that paranoid leaders then live longer and maybe do better for their societies?
And they certainly live longer. Whether they do better depends on what their program is and whether they're out to help their society or just to help themselves. But yeah, I think a certain degree of paranoia is probably necessary to be a successful leader. Other questions? I guess I have a two-part question. Yeah.
The first is you talked about how the assassination of Julius Caesar occurred at one of the last possible moments before he was about to go on campaign.
Yes.
So were his assassins basically like a group of college students, putting off that group project to the last minute?
Yeah, there's an element of that in it. But they had to, it's also that they wanted to stage it just right. First of all, they wanted to kill him themselves with their own hands, which when you think about it, it's really kind of grotesque. But they wanted to do it. Secondly, they wanted to do it in a Senate meeting because they want the Senate, first of all, was the most elite political body in Rome, much more elite than the American Senate is today. So it was really the place where aristocrats would be. But they wanted to make the point that although it was personal on a certain level, but it was also for the good of Rome as a whole. The Romans believed that the founder of Rome was a man named Romulus. Romulus became a king, and he got too big for his britches. So the Romans believed that he was also killed in a meeting of the Senate. This is a complete myth, but that's what they thought. And they thought that somehow this was the appropriate thing to do. It would bring Rome back to the founding and make the message to all the Roman people. So my point is, yeah, they weren't any kind of last minute, like college students pulling an all-nighter. But they also didn't have that many opportunities to do it. So it had to be just the right place and the right time.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question was, had they missed that opportunity, had Caesar listened to the soothsayer or, just woken up with a cold, had he missed that meeting and gone on campaign, do you think that, this desire for revenge would have subsided? Like, would Caesar have been proven right that the forgiveness had worked? Or do you think the resentment would still be there in 2, 3, 4 years whenever he came back to Rome from Parthia?
Oh, I think the resentment would have been huge. I mean, as I said, these are aristocrats, and honor is the most important thing in the world for them. They would just be nursing this honor and nursing their grudges. It would just go on and on and on. And they would have been, I can't say gunning for him, but they would have been knifing for him when he came back. They wouldn't have been able to kill him because once he went on campaign, he would be surrounded by a bodyguard and he'd be untouchable.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you said that Caesar was killed by 60 different senators, so they knew about it. Now, how could 60 senators keep a secret that Caesar wouldn't know?
Okay, so there's 60 senators in the plot, we're told, and he's actually only 23 of them actually stab him. So some of them either chicken out or they don't. I think they chicken out, actually, they don't come. But you ask a really good question. How could they keep a secret? And the answer is they couldn't. Caesar was getting reports of this conspiracy. And so on the one hand, Caesar's a very macho guy, really macho guy. He's the guy who's conquered Gaul. He considers himself not just the greatest politician, but the greatest general of his age. And his attitude is, I'm not afraid of these wars. I defeated them. They wouldn't dare touch me. That's one attitude. Another attitude is the soothsayer tells him, beware the Ides of March. He actually says, beware the month leading up to the Ides of March. But same diff, because on the Ides of March, he sees the soothsayer. He gets up that morning, he sees the soothsayer. The soothsayer says, the Ides of March, Caesar says to the soothsayer, excuse me, the Ides of March have come, soothsayer. And the soothsayer says, aye, but not gone, Caesar. That's in Shakespeare, but it's also in the ancient sources. But the other thing that happens is that Caesar's wife, he makes a political marriage. He marries a woman from the political leadership class of Rome. Her father was one of the great senators, politicians of the age. And she says to him, no, don't go. They're going to kill you. Don't go to the Senate meeting. Please, I beg you, don't go to the Senate meeting. And he says, okay, I won't go. Just this once, I'll do it. And the conspirators get a message. Caesar's not going to come to the Senate meeting. So what they do is send one of the conspirators that's particularly tight with Caesar, not someone who Caesar had to forgive, because someone who was always on Caesar's side. And he meets with Caesar and he says, I'm really disappointed in you, Julie. I thought you were a man, but you're hiding behind your wife's skirts. What kind of man are you? You're not going to come to the Senate meeting? I'm done with you. And Caesar says, all right, I guess I better go, just this once. And that's how they get him. So yeah, he knew. I remember when he's going onto the steps of the Senate, there's a guy, I think his name is Artemidorus. He says, Caesar, I got it. You got to read my documents. You got to read it. It was the names of the conspirators. She says, get away. Busy, later, give it to me later. And yeah, he's hearing it every single day that there's going to be a conspiracy. He doesn't believe it. This often happens in military affairs. So Stalin got every single day, Stalin got reports, the Germans are coming. They're building roads. The tanks are on the border. Here, let's go to invade the Soviet Union. Stalin says, he'd never do that. It's just a bluff. He wants something from him. It would never happen. This sort of thing happens all the time. Questions?
Yeah, my path here. Obviously, without social media and without, we've got oral history of how people never learn.
Right.
So you're bringing it to Stalin in that particular time. I'd really be interested in your perspective of the classic and the ancient, where we haven't learned even now about the forgiveness and the leadership piece. A lot's talked about it, but I don't think we take it back to the ancient and kind of seeing where we're coming from historically. So I'd be interested in your take on maybe not learning the lesson or developing it appropriately.
Well, I said I understand your question correctly. Is it why don't we learn from history, or?
Well, that's the overriding. But I'm just so interested in, we're talking about Stalin saying, hey, they'd never do that. I'm untouchable.
Right.
It seems like that's the pervasive tragic flaw to, from a Shakespeare standpoint. But how come we don't learn that? What is your history and what your scholarship tell you about our inability to do that from a leadership standpoint?
I think once you become a leader, it's very hard to get accurate information because everybody wants something from you. And so they flatter you. So flattery is a big problem that all leaders have. It's very hard for leaders to find out what's really going on, get accurate information, and to judge things. There are all these stories about kings who slug when sledding in the streets. You hear what the people have to say. I think there's a real truth in that, it is very hard to know what the people are thinking, what they have to say. It's very hard to be sagacious, sagacity, cleverness, these are not virtues that our society prizes or that we teach very much. How do you have good judgment? How do you make good decisions? Everything in our society is fast, snap, now. But to make good judgments, have good decisions, first of all, you have to have a fair amount of experience, which means old is good. Sorry, young people, I hate to tell you, old is good when it comes to making decisions. You don't want to hear this, but you really have to listen to your parents and listen to your teachers because they know something. Young is good too. Young people have energy. Young people are more risk takers. But old people actually have been around the block, and they know things. So often things happen now in our politics and our society, and I think, oh, wait a minute. I remember that from the 1970s. That's not new. But of course, you can't remember from the 1970s if you weren't around. So I think that's one reason. It's really hard to be a leader, You have to make decisions fast, but you have to have developed the skills and the judgment so that you'll make them well. And you have to have good advisors and get good advice. Caesar had one problem. He thought he was smarter than anybody else. That didn't work out so well for him. The smartest man in the room thing and sucking all the air out of the room is still a big problem today. One of the reasons why Augustus was successful is he knew that he was good at some things and not good at others. He knew he was no good at war. He was brave enough. He went to the battlefield, he got wounds, but he was terrible when it came to plotting campaigns. Luckily for him, he had a childhood friend who was a superb general, a man named Marcus Agrippa. And Augustus was smart enough to know what he didn't know. And he would listen to him. Part of your historical account, described that Caesar had a power differential with the senators. Yeah. And there was a disparity or a lack of respect between them, right or for. So in a modern context, if we're trying to take any wisdom from that history, is, do you think that constructing an environment where respect from the top authority and the workmen should be emphasized so as to reduce that strife and limit the need for having to impart forgiveness or that forgiveness? It's priding oneself before you. So thank you. I think your question is, should leaders have more respect for more humble people? Yes, certainly they should. I think to have someone as arrogant as Caesar is a recipe for trouble, a recipe for disaster. Maybe there never even would have been a civil war if Caesar had been less arrogant and if his opponents had been less arrogant. I mean, one of the lessons of this is the importance of compromise, the importance of give and take. Not always compromising. Sometimes you need to know to be tough, but you want to get a lot of opinions. You want to respect other people's opinions. And then you have to have the courage to stand up and make a decision, which might be unpopular. So yes, respect and listen to others, but then take the responsibility of making the decision and standing by it, wherever it may lead. And accept the fact that if you're the leader, you're not going to be buddies with your old friends. You're not yourself anymore in a way. You are the office, and the office requires things of people that are not necessarily pleasant for everyday life. I think that is one of Caesar's problems, that he didn't quite understand it. He didn't realize dictator. He didn't even know what that really meant, being dictator in perpetuity, and that it meant that he couldn't forgive people and he couldn't treat them in the way that they were before, when he had before. But I don't think he was ready to accept the fact that he was basically an emperor. It took another generation to do that. So yes, respect and give and take, but then also realizing that the office is bigger than any one person.
This kind of builds off of what you're saying. Yeah. I'd be curious how do you compare a leader like Julius Caesar to later emperors like Marcus Aurelius and these other figures that come later that are emperors? And what are the most important differences in their leadership?
Well, that's a really good question. Marcus Aurelius is certainly my favorite emperor, and he's many people's favorite emperors. He is possibly the only Roman emperor who was a truly good human being. And we know that because he wrote the Meditations, this wonderful, powerful book of philosophy about how to live your life. The only problem with that is he wasn't that great an emperor because he was too nice. The emperors in general were not nice guys, but the ones who were the most successful, I think, are the ones who are able to check their ego at the door as much as possible. It's really hard to check your ego at the door when you're a Roman emperor, because there's too many people who want to build up your ego. That's a problem that Caesar had as well. But someone like Vespasian, who basically accepted the fact that he was kind of a slob by Roman standards and didn't mind it. The story about Vespasian is he puts a tax on latrines in Rome. And one of his sons, Domitian, who is a guy who puts on airs, says, "Father, this is beneath your dignity. How can you do this?" And his famous reply is, "Son, money has no smell." I mean, that sort of attitude served some of the emperors well.
Thank you, Lecture Strauss, for talking for this really engaging community. When I consequential acts of political influence in the history of Islam, like Islam has been part of Richard Nixon,
Right.
in 1974.
Right.
And I'm curious what your thoughts are about how Susan appropriately put Ford's act on Amazon as a leading kind of personal act of the women's, or reading that you talked about before about women's maybe confirming expressing because he thought it was in the best interest of the country. How do you feel Susan would be on that?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, yes, Ford did say he was doing it for the best interest of the country, and I would agree. I think it was for the best interest of the country. Was it the best interest of justice? Probably not. But in terms of peace and political life, I think it was for the best. I think Caesar would have thought that was appropriate and on that occasion to pardon him. We think it's something different.
But sure, it's not party, right? Then they have been dual motivation. And then I can see perhaps he's are favoring one and not the other, and sure that how we potentially reconcile them.
Caesar wanted to pardon people he had defeated. That was important for him. If Ford could have felt that he had defeated Nixon, that he had replaced Nixon, if Ford felt that if this was a gesture coming from on high, then Caesar would have approved of it. But if you remember, Jerry Fang said, "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln." If you remember the joke, Caesar wouldn't have liked that. He would have said, from Caesar's point of view, you should have said, "I'm not just a Ford, I'm a Lincoln." That's how Caesar would have looked at it. So I think Caesar would have found that you could pardon Nixon for the good of the country, but you must also use this as an occasion to show your superiority, to show your aristocracy and your nobility. And he would have said, as Caesar once said about another politician, he didn't learn his political ABCs. And I think he would have said that Ford could have been reelected, or Ford could have been elected in 1976 if he had known how to portray himself, if he had known to show he was a superior person. Instead, by saying, "I'm just a Ford, not a Lincoln," he was digging his own political grave.
Yeah. I was going to ask a question, and we have maybe time for one or two more after that. One. So I'll just hold moderator's privilege here.
Yeah.
So I was thinking how you described the culture, the political culture of Rome as sort of a face-to-face culture.
Yes.
And as someone who doesn't know a lot about Roman culture, I think of them as sort of a system, a culture of law, right? And then I thought maybe one of the lessons from this episode is that when dealing with crimes against the state or against the person of the leadership, maybe the solution is not to rely on the good character or the wisdom, sagacity of the leader, but follow the law. That, is that borne out in Roman history? Did they think about why we might need more laws as opposed to relying on the virtue or lack thereof of our leaders?
I mean, that's an excellent question. And you're absolutely right. The Romans were a people of law that developed now later, but still at this period, yes, there was a great respect for the law. But I would say two things. First, the Romans also thought that personal qualities were absolutely essential. And they would never think you could have a good society, just because you had good laws. You couldn't have good laws unless you also had good men, they would have said. And so personal qualities were always a major ingredient, a major part of the deal, I think they would have said. And secondly, this is a revolutionary period. Caesar becoming dictator for life, this is pulling a rabbit out of a hat. There's no such thing. They're making it up as it goes along. And I think that's one of the reasons why the conspirators say, we're not going to let this guy do it. we're not going to let him take our republic away from us. We're going to insist on doing things the way they're supposed to be done. Killing people. No, of course, that's not the way they're supposed to be done. But both sides are behaving outside the lines of proper behavior.
Okay, maybe last question.
So, it seems like a big lesson from this lecture is readers learning to when to forgive and when to take vengeance.
Right.
And so what I was wondering is how should a leader know when they should forgive their enemies or when they should take vengeance upon their enemies, and how do they know which option is best for the country or what?
Your question. I just make a slight difference. They know when to forgive and when to punish. Okay. Two answers. One is they should study history. They should take my courses and read my books. They should definitely study history. And second, I think people need to be educated for character. They need to be educated for character from an early age. And they need to know that when they go out in the world, they have to learn from their own experiences and from the experience of those who've been around a bit longer. You learn by doing, but you also learn by studying the past, the lessons of the past, by having examples of good character, by modeling yourself on those examples. There's no rule book. You have to make judgments as you go along. It's really tough. But that's what leadership is all about. So study history, study leadership, find good models, role models, and follow them. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Can I ask you one last question? I asked the first. Did another Italian write up a more on-point user's guide for leaders in 1511?
He did, yes. His name was Machiavelli. And it's a very good book, but it's also a very dangerous book. We don't want to think that everything you need to know of leadership is in Machiavelli's Prince. Even Machiavelli didn't believe that. He wrote another book called The Discourses, which is about princes are bad, republics are better. But yes, there are some very, very valuable lessons there. I would say that Aristotle is a better guide than Machiavelli. Thank you for these great questions. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much to the Tommy Thompson Center for sponsoring this event. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.
Look back on April 9th.
Thank you.
I felt like I was back in Rome. You every morning, every saying the thing. So it's well, you can hear it all, right? Like, where you said it takes. We're going to have to do something else. Next time we hit buzzers and buzzers.
I heard the buzz. Was that one of the buzzers?
Yeah.